Chapter 1 will have 2 lecture videos, and in those lecture videos, we will first introduce our topic for the semester, and then look specifically at some of the important aspects of research methodology that you need to be familiar with. Before we get started, I want you to take a second and think about these 2 questions. In your own words, how would you define adolescence? And how would you define emerging adulthood? Go ahead and pause the video for just a second, think of your own definition for each of these terms, and proceed with the lecture when ready. Many of you probably came up with very different definitions for adolescence and emerging adulthood. During these 2 developmental periods, we see a vast degree of growth and change happening across many different domains of our life. Before I define those 2 terms for you, I want to point something out. Throughout the semester, you will get to enjoy many awkward pictures of me as a teenager. Here are our first 2. When I say teenager, I of course mean an adolescent. We define adolescence as the time period that starts when an individual reaches puberty through adulthood. This period of development is primarily characterized for many individuals by preparation for adulthood. It's the transitional period between being a child and being an adult. We tend to break adolescence down into early or 10 to 14 and late adolescence, 15 to 18. The top picture is me during early adolescence, or as close as I could get. Facebook did not exist for much of my early adolescence, and late adolescence, or when I graduated from high school, which is actually a very important distinction when it comes to defining adolescence. As I mentioned, adolescence typically begins around age 10 when the early stages of puberty begin. Early puberty, as we'll talk a little bit more about later, doesn't necessarily involve observable changes, but typically speaking, the transitional period begins around that age. Adolescence ends at age 18, at least in America and other countries. 17 or 18 tends to be the marker. But traditionally speaking, for much of Western culture at least, and many parts of other cultures, we mark the end of adolescence by the ending of secondary school, or for us, graduation from high school. My next thought question for you, I want you to take a second and think about how you would describe what it feels like to be 18 to 25. Pause the video, jot down a few words that come to mind, and proceed with the lecture when you're ready. Emerging adulthood for many people is a very unique time that is marked by a lot of characteristics that we don't necessarily see throughout much of the rest of our life. Emerging adulthood refers to the time period between age 18 and 25, and it's marked by similar transition and change as adolescence. I do want to quickly point out, and we'll have the opportunity to talk about this in more detail in later chapters, but emerging adulthood does not exist in all cultures. We know that emerging adulthood as a unique period of development is common in the US and Canada, as well as much of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan. But most countries outside of this list don't necessarily have the ages of 18 through 25 as a stage that's different from early adulthood. So much of what we'll talk about together this semester is very culturally specific, and I want you to remember that while we talk about emerging adulthood in general. This is not an experience that everyone has, and how we experience emerging adulthood is very culturally specific as well. We'll have the opportunity to talk about that later on. Another interesting historical thing I want to mention about emerging adulthood is that it's a relatively new period of life. And there's 2 aspects to this. First of all, prior to more recent decades, emerging adulthood was very much not different from early adulthood for any given individual. As college has become more common, so has the experience of a unique developmental period. I also want to mention that the developmental period of emerging adulthood is relatively new in psychological literature. You can think of it as a new stage of life that we've discovered, even though it's of course been going on for a long time. As I mentioned earlier, emerging adulthood stands out because it is characterized by some experiences and feelings that we do not have throughout the rest of our life. The feeling of, or the experience of identity exploration, the feeling of instability, an increased degree of self-focus, feelings of in-betweenness, and a higher degree of possibility and optimism. So let's first look at identity exploration. We'll have the chance to talk about this in more detail later on in the semester, but identity exploration is defined as the period of trying to form our opinions and developing an understanding of ourself. This is a concept first proposed by Erik Erikson, and although he believed much of identity exploration happened during adolescence, for most adults, this now occurs more often during emerging adulthood. So you can look at me trying on different majors and choosing psychology in college. That was part of my identity exploration. For many people, this involves trying out different relationships and experiences with love, investigating different approaches to sexuality, trying out different careers, looking in and questioning our own political and religious and moral ideology, and also trying out new hobbies. A lot of the way that we feel about the world develops during this period of life. I mentioned instability earlier. For many people, emerging adulthood is a time of frequent change, whether it be your residence where you live, educational changes, leaving high school, starting college, graduating college, work changes, leaving high school and starting a specific job or trying out different types of employment. And then, of course, instability in relationships as well. Again, when we leave high school, most people have the opportunity of leaving some relationships behind, forming new ones, or even seeing changes within those relationships we've had for much of our life. We see changes in the relationships we have with parents, changes in how we approach friendships, how important friendships are, and changes in how we conceptualize and approach romantic relationships. We know one example of this. Many Americans move out of their parents' house during emerging adulthood, but in other countries, this is less common. Children will continue to live with their parents throughout emerging adulthood and experience instability in other aspects of their life. I also mentioned a higher degree of self-focus. And when I say that, I do not mean that emerging adults are selfish. By self-focus, I mean that we are spending a larger degree of our life, of our time, focusing on development of ourself, on our own skills, knowledge, self-understanding. Going back to identity development, we focus a lot of our time and energy on figuring out who we are and what we want. And a big part of this is learning to be independent. I mentioned that many people during early adulthood experience a feeling of being in between. You're not a teenager anymore, but you're not an adult. I might be an emerging adult, but I still want to sit on Santa's lap and take a picture from time to time. We know that most emerging adults actually report not feeling like an adult, and many people say that in some ways they've reached adulthood, but in others they're not. So this is a very unique transition. It's this time period between the freedom of adolescence and the responsibility of being a true adult. For most people, this tends to be a time of optimism, where we are exploring and thinking of all of the many possibilities, places where our lives will take us, paths we can take. And for most people, we tend to have a pretty optimistic or positive outlook. We are confident that we're going to achieve those goals and happiness. As I mentioned, there are cultural variations in the experience of emerging adulthood. Across many cultures that do have emerging adulthood as a unique period, we see a general increase in accepting responsibility for oneself, the ability to begin making independent decisions, and the emergence of financial independence. Those are the three markers. If you were to ask someone, hey, what makes someone an adult? These are the three things that they would say. And these all begin to take form during emerging adulthood. We haven't reached all of them yet. Maybe we're not fully financially independent or fully making our own decisions. But for the first time, we're beginning to make steps in these directions. These three traits are more consistent for an individualistic perspective, or a culture that values individualism, an emphasis on standing for oneself and on self-sufficiency. However, some cultures are better defined as collectivists, or emphasizing collectivism, duties to other people. And in those cultures, these three markers of adulthood might be less common. So, for example, if you asked someone from a non-Western or a more traditional culture what it means to be an adult, they're more likely to say things like getting married, emphasizing marriage as a marker of adulthood, or even emphasizing physical features like growing a beard or developing a certain stature, or maybe even in some cultures reaching the stage where you're able to have children. Another interesting characteristic we see happening sometimes, or popping up sometimes, is an emphasis on specific characteristics. For example, an individual might say, someone who has mastered self-control. You have to master that characteristic before you're considered an adult. So this is kind of a non-Western perspective on what it means to truly reach adulthood. Lecture video 2 will pick up by looking at a few important aspects of the scientific study of adolescence and emerging adulthood.